If I could go back in time to a past self, say 30 years ago, and tell this past self that video games would be the most popular form of entertainment and everyone and his mother would be playing them, and that the CCP of China would be enacting edicts to prevent or limit the amount of hours the people in China could play video games, I probably wouldn't have believed any of that, because back in the day, of course, video games were uniquely unpopular, and to the extent they were, only popular with geeks. Nobody really played video games that was cool, at least for the most part. But we're not living back then. We're living in 2021, and many of you might caught wind of this, but the CCP has proclaimed an edict that all citizens of China below the age of 18 are soon to be only allowed to play a maximum of 3 hours a week of video games. And they've had similar restrictions in the past, not quite as limiting, but it's an interesting phenomenon because it naturally gives rise to the interesting debate/discussion around the notion of authoritarian governance versus less authoritarian governance, what you can get done as an authoritarian government and what you cannot get done as a not-so-authoritarian government. One can only imagine what would happen if the federal government of the United States came out and said, hey guys, we're issuing federal mandates that state you can only play X amount of hours a day or week of video games. People would be livid. Not so much in China. And there's several interesting things about this. One of the interesting things is the fact that conglomerates like Tencent are understandably bending the knee to this edict, and it's pretty obvious why. This actually hurts the bottom line of video game developers and publishers, and Tencent is very much involved in video games. But they claim that it's a good thing and they're well on board with it. For example, they will be requiring, in many cases, real name registration in terms of playing these games so the government and Tencent can keep track of individuals who are playing games to make sure they're not violating the new limit that's been proclaimed. So there's that aspect, and that was to be expected. And the other aspect, of course, being that video games being such a huge and profitable industry, well, it's hurting the bottom line of a lot of people, and increasingly these days, games such as Gauge and Impact and a few others, the Chinese developer market is growing in terms of the games they produce, and they're reaching a Western market and presumably a Chinese market too. But when the CCP enacts legislation like this and proclaims it loudly to the world, it's going to limit growth. On top of that, frankly speaking, I think this is just a flex. China does like to flex sometimes about these things. They want to say to the world, look what we can do, we can prevent X. But beyond that, I don't think the story is really that interesting. There's another element to this that's far more interesting than China flexing and proclaiming to the world that they're going to ban or limit the amount of hours of gameplay are available to its citizens. That being why people play video games in the first place. Because, of course, you won't get official legislation in the West. You won't get government saying you can only play so-and-so much per week. That would be intolerable to most people. But you'll certainly get people complaining about things like video game addiction and wasting time and not being productive and so on and so forth. And that certainly happens. Some people truly spend too much time playing video games. But even in the case of people who spend, say, 15, 16, 17, 18 hours a day playing video games, I think the question naturally arises as to why. Why does anyone do anything? In the case of video games, this has been talked about before, but it bears repeating. They often offer challenges and rewards that are not to be had in real life. And so really what's happening, and I think it's in part reflective of what's happening in China in addition to the West, is that for many individuals, video games simply offer a better deal than reality. And a reality that increasingly doesn't offer a lot of reward or reasons for working hard and doing certain things. Why do people work jobs, for example, especially difficult jobs or dirty jobs like sanitation or sewage removal? Because it's fun? No, because they get paid. And presumably they get paid a fair amount of money in such cases. But in general, these incentives simply don't exist anymore. if in fact there's a problem, seemingly globally, with people playing video games excessively, I don't think the issue per se is the video games. Of course, there is an issue there. There is the concept of whaling, which is to say, designing, making games such that people get sucked into them. And of course, all games have intentionally developed features that can be addictive. But I think it falls to authorities and people who are concerned about this phenomenon, far more than the individuals, the consumers, to investigate and ask themselves why people would end up spending copious amounts of hours a day playing video games. Because it doesn't make sense to offer an alternative that is worse. In this case, if you read through some of the articles, China will cite the lack of attention to schoolwork or family obligations and so on and so forth. Okay, fine. That's probably all true. The question is, what do these individuals, whether they're in China or the United States or Europe or anywhere, get for their investment and hard work going forward if they decide to play fewer video games and spend less time with them, being quote-unquote productive? What will they get? Will they become productive wages of society? Okay. What do they get for that? Because time and again, every time this question of video game addiction or playing too many video games comes up, the people who ask the question are not realizing the reasons why they're asking the question. They're seeing the end result of something rather than looking at the causes. If certain video games are so enticing that people will spend 14, 15, 16 hours a day playing them, you have to ask yourself why. Yes, there are baked-in goodies into these video games that make them addictive. There's a dopamine overload, no doubt. But oftentimes, if you dig into it, you'll see that the lives that exist as alternatives to these people playing video games are dull, dismal, depressing, and sometimes hopeless. So, in many ways, we've arrived at a stage of between a rock and a hard place. I fully agree that if there are, in fact, productive alternatives, spending all day, 12, 14, 15 hours a day playing video games, probably isn't a good idea. If you can find something productive that you think will lead somewhere, if it makes sense to pursue it. But time and again, all I hear as an alternative is people should just go through the motions and do what they always have been doing and always been told to do. Okay, now there are alternatives. What will people do to rise to the occasion to challenge some of these alternatives that are on offer? And when I ask that question, I get a lot of silence, not many answers to that question, especially from the most critical people. Because I think if you have half a brain, you know that many traditional life paths simply don't work anymore, and to the extent they do, they're not giving you a sufficient reward. So in a sense, gaming as a phenomenon, excessive gaming, is very much a symptom rather than a cause. There are complexities there, no doubt. As I mentioned several times already, many games are meant to be addictive, to suck you in. But that's not the whole story, not by a long shot. And whilst it's an interesting flex on the part of the Chinese government to attempt to limit game time to 3 hours a week, I'm not sure if it's going to be successful. In summary, everything in excess is potentially destructive, but people always need to ask the question as to why people are engaging in this excessive behavior. And usually, it's due to a lack in some other area. Usually. In the case of video games, time and again, people don't want to go there. Because if they did, they'd acknowledge why people are spending so much time playing video games. Because it's bloody better than the alternative half the time. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. As always, please hit the like button, subscribe, share the video, hit the bell icon to be informed of forthcoming videos. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Take care. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.